Greg, what's going on, man?
I am having a wonderful afternoon here in Los Angeles, California.
I love it. It sounds like Los Angeles, California in the background.
Yes.
Nice ring to it. Greg, I thought a fun way to start this episode would be to ask you if you could tell people about the investing thesis of a hippie venture fund.
Well, I think it's important to talk about the origins of this fund and how it's evolved and what we are focused on today. Basically, when the focus of our fund is really on mental health and technologies and solutions and therapies that can elevate our mental health and wellness. And what that really means is looking at modalities that can really dramatically transform people's lives and have a rapid acting effect on people's lives. And so what that really means is we're focused on investing in categories like psychedelic medicine and neurotechnology, as well as areas like precision psychiatry. And those are really, I believe, new and old, ancient really, ways to allow people to heal and enable them to heal in ways that have not been generally made available by our broader medical establishment. In terms of the origins of PsyMed Ventures, I'm a entrepreneur and been working in and around startups for about a decade. And after my last startup, I was really thinking about what was next and wanted to orient myself in a field and in an area that I felt really passionate about and really heart aligned with. And one of my observations just broadly about the world when I was thinking about that came to realize that in many ways, my belief was that the hippies were right about many of the ideals and ethos and ways of life that they lived in the 1960s in particular. And that ranges from things like healthy eating and veganism, you could say, to the introduction of the music festival, to psychedelics and cannabis use, to Eastern practices and modalities like yoga. So, when I was thinking about it, one of the things that dawned on me was that many of those areas have actually very much already been have gone through the Overton window, have been made their way into culture. And it dawned on me that psychedelics and psychedelic medicine was one that was still kind of on the periphery and hadn't quite passed through. And so really, in terms of that origin story, that was kind of like a strong signal for me internally. At the same time, I've also really benefited from psychedelic medicine in my own life, and it's been a transformative tool for me. So I felt really my own, I was able to kind of grok my own transformation and the ways that I benefited from it in ways that I felt like could be helpful to addressing other people's lives. And at the same time, I spent months looking at the research and reading scientific papers from Imperial College London, Johns Hopkins, et cetera. And I did a lot of this early work with Matthias, who's one of my best friends, my co-host for Business Trip, the podcast, which is another thing that we started, and also partner in PsyMed Ventures. And so, it was kind of this amalgamation of both a theory or a thesis that I had on a personal level, my own personal experiences, my interest in entrepreneurship and startups. And, the alchemy of all of that is really what has created both this podcast, Business Trip, and PsyMed Ventures, this venture fund that I feel really grateful and to be working on and passionate about.
That's awesome. I always love when people talk about or think about their career that whether they know it or not, everything that they've done in their life has kind of led them to this moment. And it sounds like the blend of personal interest, professional interest, opportunity, change you want to see in the world, you're really at the center of it, man. And it's awesome. I also think one of the things that I wanted to ask you about that I think is so fascinating is I could see where someone looks at someone investing in a category like psychedelics and would potentially see some competing interests there. So you have obviously investors who want the highest return on their dollar. I'm sure you have LPs in your fund. They want you guys to absolutely make the most money. And then you have these sacred substances and the way in which they're used that oftentimes there's different debates about what is most appropriate. For example, we just had Andy Johns on the podcast, and he talked about how lots of pharma companies are trying to basically make these synthetic compounds to mirror things that grow in nature, and they don't want to have any type of indigenous traditions. And so I just see they're kind of being an interesting potential tension there. And I'd love to hear how you, as an investor, think about that. Where there's the preservation of these sacred things, and then there's also, financial opportunity and financial responsibility that you guys have.
Yes, it's a really great question and an important topic. So I think it's really important to acknowledge that indigenous cultures have been working with psychedelic medicine for millennia, right? And there are deeply rooted practices that they have and a deep amount of knowledge and wisdom that they keep. And I think it is important. It's really important that that people who get involved in this space educate themselves about the history, specifically the indigenous history around psychedelic medicine. And that's something that is definitely both an opportunity to learn and an opportunity also to decide and to, at one's own volition, to integrate elements that of what their traditions are into how you show up in this space. So for me and for PsyMed, what that has meant is we are engaging in what we like to call our a pledge, a reciprocity pledge, where we are donating a percentage of our fund's profits back to indigenous cultures and psychedelic nonprofits. That practice in particular is something that a handful of companies and a couple funds have also done. Ultimately, it's up to any participant to decide how and if they want to engage in that way. But I think the first step is just education and educating ourselves about their historical use of these medicines. And I think that they have incredibly wise things to contribute, right? And like in that they've been, in particular, in that they've been working with plant medicines for so long, and there's so much, so many learnings, so much wisdom there. And so I think what can be tricky, and I think it's also worth noting, is that the psychedelic field is really multidisciplinary, right? Like if you think of it like a Venn diagram, you have, as we're talking about here, the indigenous communities, which are really global. There's a high concentration of them in South America. But then in addition to that, in psychedelic world, you have people that are working on it in the scientific capacity as researchers at universities. You have people in the business community who are starting companies around commercializing the psychedelic plant medicine and synthetics. You also have the drug reform and drug policy community. You have the harm reduction community, which is all about educating ways for those who are working with psychedelics to do so in ways that reduce the potential harm that they may cause. You have the community of folks that have been incarcerated due to psychedelic use, and I can go on.
I just saw the LSD king got out of jail recently.
Yeah.
Which is a wild story if people don't know about it. Basically, this guy got caught for selling a lot of LSD. What is it, 20 years ago? Something like that. Like 20. He was in prison for like 20 or 30 years, and he just got out.
Yeah, I mean, to wrap up that point, it can be quite challenging for any one participant within the psychedelic field to be connected and educated across all of the different domains. And so I actually feel part of my role and my calling in this space is to be a connector of sorts, and in bringing in both making introductions to people from disparate fields, and also on our podcast bringing in voices that can amplify important messages. And so, we've done, for example, we recently did an episode with a retreat center that is in Peru and Costa Rica, and they work with indigenous Shipibo healers. And that was a great episode to tell the story of how do you build a business that's a retreat center, but also doing it hand in hand with an indigenous community, and what's the knowledge that they hold. And so, yeah, I think that being able to tell stories about that history, and then making it easier for people to ultimately come to a decision if that's something that they want to decide how they want to engage in that capacity if you're working in the industry itself.
Do you think that I just was with a friend of mine who is a prolific startup founder, just before this, and he actually has never had any of these experiences. And we were talking about, like, what does it look like for 10 years from now? Do you think people that perhaps are just, maybe they're, living business lives, they don't have any diagnosed mental health issues, but they want to have a transformative experience. Do you think that 5 to 10 years from now, people will still need to travel to places like you just described to do that?
Your question is, will those types of experiences be made available within the United States? Those experiences.
Yes. Will you be able to, as someone that does not have that does not, on their deathbed, or has PTSD or diagnosed anxiety or any of these things that we're talking about, is that going to be something that is going to be legal in the US for pure enhancement?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think that there is a good chance, and there's a couple ways how it could happen. So one is there's actually a case that has been, I would say, within the court system, called the right to try case. And it's specifically, in this instance, people who are actually at the end of their lives and in palliative care and looking to access psychedelics, for their own personal reasons. And there's a chance that that would ultimately enable people to access psychedelics for those reasons. It's also happening in Canada. At the same time, it's also worth noting that there's a lot of movement and progress happening in states, particularly Oregon and Colorado. And in both of those states, you will be allowed to access psilocybin specifically in for non-therapeutic purposes. So you won't need to have a diagnosis. It can be for therapeutic purposes, but it also can be for personal development, spiritual purposes. Like, you don't even need to say. You can go to a facility and have a supervised experience. So, that's the Republic, I guess, doing its thing, where it's not just on the federal level, but on the state level, it will be a different dynamic.
Fighting back. I love it.
Yeah.
One thing, switching gears a little bit, one thing you said earlier in the conversation that I wanted to talk a little bit more about is you mentioned this idea of precision therapy. That's actually a term that I haven't heard before and would love to know more about.
Yeah. The gist of precision psychiatry is that we ultimately will be able to have an understanding of one's physiology that is based on your genomics, your metabolomics, based on your just entire composition. And that is night and day different than it is right now, where you walk into a clinician's office or a mental health practitioner, and you're basically signing, taking a survey, having an intake, having a conversation, and through that, you're getting a diagnosis. And so there's really, I believe, a huge opportunity to be able to precisely diagnose and treat each individual, because we are all unique. with a lot more data to support it. So, a recent example of a company doing this that's interesting is Alto Neuroscience, and they are developing ways to create medicines specifically based off of EEG data and aggregating huge amounts of data to determine ultimately which patients may respond better or worse to a certain medication that they're developing for depression. So we're just scratching the surface on this. There's a lot of data that can ultimately be collected and analyzed. And then there's new therapeutics that could ultimately be developed based on that data.
That's fascinating. So today, I mean, I'm so interested. I imagine for that to really occur, there would need to be some type of like standardization of, these are the inputs that we need to some model that the psychiatry industry, for example, would need to then be educated on how to interpret.
Yeah. I would say the number one thing that is required is accumulating a sufficient amount of data and having it standardized. That's the name of the game, and it's kind of in process right now. So, wearing my investor hat when we speak with companies that are interested in developing either a diagnostic or a drug or therapy that's linked to precision psychiatry, like one of the top things that we're thinking through is, will they be able to aggregate a sufficient amount of data to actually be able to reliably make proper inferences off of that? And then if the answer is yes, then it actually, I think, will be easier for the clinician or physician, because for them, it's just like, collect the data for their one individual patient, and then they'll be able to map it to an entire database of information that a company or organization is providing that will then be able to help them determine how to treat the patient.
Yeah, really interesting. I was having a conversation with a gentleman named Daniel Ingram, who's in some ways it kind of reminds me of this. He has a organization called the Emergent Phenomena Research Consortium that basically is trying to collect all of the different data around spiritual phenomena and experiences that people have to ultimately help people come up with actual solutions that have clinical outcomes related to them. Because today, I mean, for anybody that has been through a serious spiritual experience, you go to Western medicine, you go to even a therapist. A lot of people just have no idea what the hell to do with you and tell you that you're stressed out. And so, yeah, I mean, the data thing is really interesting. It's funny when I just think about our healthcare system. One of the things that stands out to me is we're collecting so much more, but we're not necessarily putting it to use when it comes actually time to application, working with a lot of these practitioners.
Yeah.
Like the idea that I have to go into a doctor's office, get a printout and list what injuries I've had over the past 10 years, or if I have any family history of X, like it just kind of seems absurd that we just continue to do that over and over again. And there isn't some type of more unified ledger that's more comprehensive.
I totally agree.
So, okay. And one of the things that I know that you're also very interested in that I think kind of dovetails with this and psychedelics is we talked a little bit about transpersonal psychology the last time we were catching up. And how there is a big opportunity to usher that in, especially as a lot of things like substances like psychedelics come online. Maybe to start, I'd love to hear you just describe like your interpretation of transpersonal psychology.
Yeah. Transpersonal psychology. I mean, it is a framework that was initially coined by Stan Grof, who was a researcher who was working with LSD starting in the 1950s, specifically looking at the therapeutic applications of it. And my interpretation of transpersonal is it is a field of psychology that really integrates the sort of or it accepts the is open and accepting to alternative realities, I would say, or one could call it the spiritual aspects of an experience. And it's something that is really, I would say, hallmark to many psychedelic experiences, particularly at higher doses. And so Groff created this framework that really he became, I would say, a foundational sort of created an interesting foundation. Has written a lot of books around it. And when I say foundation, I don't mean like a charity. I mean like body of work and literature. And so, yeah, one area that I definitely think about is the how important it will be for there to be resources and an understanding available to individuals who have profound psychedelic experiences and are able to make sense of them through transpersonal psychology. And so, yeah, one other thing to note, I was actually just chatting with my partner Matthias about the concept of transpersonal psychology, and one thing he reminded me of is, in Groff's framework, it really he says that within these experiences, the psychedelic experiences, like it starts with the psychological and psychodynamic experience. Then people often will have the perinatal experience, which is really around returning to memories of being in the womb. And
Groff loved that. He
right.
focused so much on that,
And the idea
birth
that your
trauma and
birth,
things like that.
totally. And the idea of the birth being the first trauma that most of us experience, but we never really heal from. Because it is, think about it, you're getting pulled out of this coddled warm sack where you're just chilling and you don't need to be, you're just being fed through a tube and life is good. And then all of a sudden you get pulled out and these bright lights appear and things are getting cut. And that's
yeah. Well, especially now with the amount of C-sections, it's like you're going to war as you start off in the world.
Totally. Yeah.
And
then following the perinatal matrices is the sort of the transpersonal experiences. And so he says that people basically will pass through, starting with the psychodynamic and the psychological, into the perinatal, then ultimately into the transpersonal. And there's actually a book that I read about this guy who has I think 72 high dose LSD experiences, and he writes very detailed trip reports of them. And he basically talks about how in his first handful of LSD experiences, he started really on the on the interpersonal psychodynamic, working through that kind of stuff. Then it took him like a dozen experiences working through the perinatal side, and only when completed through that, he was able to kind of have more like exploration about consciousness and the universe, and the sort of the less the more ethereal, let's call it, concepts.
I definitely have like a theory on this that I actually wrote about, where I think psychedelics, they provide like a temporary leap in consciousness, but depending upon kind of your starting point and how much like clouds are over the sun, right? Like that leap for you could just be like more insight on your interpersonal relationships. But maybe as you grow spiritually and grow in your consciousness, evolve your consciousness, perhaps the next leap is that natal thing, and then perhaps the next leap is to temporarily experience what it might be like to be an enlightened being. And so it is really interesting to think about like what is the mechanism there that differentiates experience on a personal level. Why do some people have transcendent experiences? Why do some people not? And they have the same dose. And I think a lot of people, like to immediately go to a physicalist perspective, where they think about things like body weight and, how are things reacting in the brain. And I do think there is something much, much more rooted in, the conscious and unconscious mind, and the amount of stuff there that one might have potentially accumulated in a lifetime that really doesn't get really doesn't get acknowledged in a lot of the circles talking about these things.
Yeah. I mean, one thing that comes up for me is like in Kabbalah, in that spiritual tradition, there's this concept that you first need to work through your emotional traumas and psychological obstacles before getting to the sort of spiritual gooey good stuff. And so maybe there's something there around, if you don't, like, your psyche, your subconscious is first going to surface the stuff that's unresolved. That's kind of the nature of a lot of psychedelic experiences, right? There's this surfacing of the things that give us anxiety, or the things that are making us depressed, or the things that have been resulting in a post-traumatic stressful state. And so, perhaps it's just your brain, it's your brain's healing intelligence trying to put it in front of you so that you can work through it and process it and be done with it, so that you can then be more happy or access other parts of not just yourself but like the collective.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because our brains file a lot of this stuff away to originally protect ourselves, and then substances like these and based on what you just described, resurface them for us to eventually heal, which is just such a fascinating thing. We get how we get in our own way sometimes. One thing I wanted your opinion on, because I know you guys are big neurotech investors, is what do you make of all these technologies that are purporting to, do things like launch people into higher states of consciousness through devices that one might attach or put next to their brain? So, for example, I don't know if we were talking about this or another one of my friends, but certain companies can put an ultrasound on someone's head and it'll vibrate certain waves that will put somebody into a completely enlightened state or unified state. What do you make of those types of claims and technologies?
Well, I think that a lot of what you're describing is probably going to be achievable. So I think we will have that capability, or it's already achievable today. And then I think the question ultimately is, is it ethical? Are there ethics that we need to consider here? I think in this context, I would think about, like, what are the cons ultimately? Or what's the concern? Is it that it could have health risks? Is it that it will make it too easy to achieve nirvana and enlightenment? Will people become addicted to those states of being? So I think that there's definitely like a conversation to be had around that. But I think directionally, I'm pretty excited about that future. I do have a meditation practice myself, but maybe it's because I'm in a busy-ish phase of life, but I'm not able to meditate as much as I want to. I mean, I do it in the mornings, and it's an important start of my day. But it's if there were a way to enable me to get to a deeper practice faster, I think I'm here for it. If there's a way for me to, and there are also potentially being second order consequences of just like being a happier person, not just not just getting to that meditative state, but like it then unlocking potentially other parts of my life. But yeah, I think that ultimately, I think it's worth exploring. Like, is there a potential for people to get too carried away with it and just be in nirvana all day and just have a feeding tube, hooked into them? I don't know. Maybe someone will want that life because it's a good life. But yeah, I think I'm for it, and I think it will be achievable, and I think that it will probably have a huge impact and influence on our culture and society, because again, we're at the pendulum has swung super far in the always on direction, right? Social media, phones, etc. And if there are ways for us to achieve achieve ways to us to really regain our presence in a impactful way, I think that will be a really welcome pendulum swing in the other direction.
Yeah, it's a really interesting thing. I mean, I've thought about it a lot, and on the one hand, I agree with you that if this can help someone get into a profound deep state faster and more reliably, that's an amazing thing. And even in the event that it's temporary, that could actually be quite useful, because then that could potentially inspire someone to get interested in meditating, get interested in developing more stabilized states of equanimity. But on the flip side, I also wonder, I just think about the impact that meditation has had on my life, where it's almost like I'm constantly trying to be in presence. I'm constantly trying to meditate. I'm constantly trying to just be the observer or the watcher. And that has been an intentional cultivated practice over a decade now. And I wonder if we introduce these type of devices that you kind of don't go through the requisite stages, but you just go zero to hero, then would it allow someone to be in those states of peace and acceptance, surrender, allowing whatever you want it to be throughout all moments of the experience of life, versus just when they have the headset on?
Yeah,
I think that is, like, to me, where those products can look and feel more like an amusement park than maybe like actually being an equanimous person. But I don't know. I mean, I
yeah.
think there's so many unknowns that we just don't understand yet. But it is very interesting to think about a future where these type of things are possible for everyone.
Yeah, I think it's a great point. What comes up for me is when my meditation practice is at its best, when I'm able to just find the present moment, be here now, be the watcher, what I feel like I'm settling into as we're speaking, it stays with me for the rest of the day. So it's possible
Good point.
that through the use of this kind of device, yeah, it gets you to that deep, deep state quickly, but then you don't actually need the device for the rest of the day, because you've kind of that message has been imprinted in your psyche and soul. So just saying, as a possibility, but again,
Yeah,
we
you have
don't
that
know.
glow.
Yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense. That's really cool. One question that I love to ask guests is, what's something that you believe in today that you didn't a year ago?
That I didn't 1 year ago. It kind of goes back to, and belief is a very funny word, because I guess the thing I believe is that you can never fully believe anything. Um, that is probably something I believe more than anything, or at least believe more than I did a year ago.
Oh my God, dude. Do I agree with that statement?
Yeah, like,
So many things I used to trust, I'm like, the veil has been pulled off my eyes.
yeah, it's one of those things that, when I think about, for example, like just the general nature of reality, I think about it quite often, probably. And what are I've always been fascinated with, like, the following questions. What preceded the Big Bang, and if the universe is expanding, what's it expanding into? Like, those are two questions that I've thought about for over a decade. And in more recent years, in the last year, let's say, like, when I think about those questions, like, there's all these different possibilities, right? Everything from we're in a simulation at the moment, to there being multiple realms of reality, to I could go on, but, like, yeah, at the end of the day, that's kind of stuff relating to the transpersonal realm. But then at the same time, just to bring it more grounded into like the scientific realm, we're constantly, researchers, scientists are constantly discovering things that have debunked what we used to think. And therefore I take everything I approach with a healthy dose of skepticism, because I just know that entire frameworks and models may actually be completely different than we once thought. And we've seen that obviously in history with, Copernicus as a striking example around the heliocentricity of the universe.
Well said. Well said. Well, Greg, it's been awesome talking to you and getting your perspective on the investor side of the world of psychedelics, of neurotechnology, of new emergent types of mental health solutions. I want to give you an opportunity to plug your podcast because I have listened to it. I think it's awesome. I think it's a really, really well done narrative for a particular interest group. And I want to make sure that people that are listening know about it.
Yeah. So Business Trip is a podcast about the business of psychedelics. And Matthias and I co-host, and each episode really is about, well, where we really started was how do you build a business in psychedelics? It's, as we've been talking about, multidisciplinary. There's no roadmap. And so it has been this opportunity to interview founders of companies that are developing psychedelic therapies, retreat centers, different technologies around psychedelics, to both understand how they're starting their businesses and ultimately be a resource to other people who want to get more involved in the field. And so it's been this really cool magnet of sorts, such that, as people listen to it, it allows them to educate, learn about all the different types of companies that are being developed, understand more about what is psychedelic therapy, how do psychedelics work in the brain, in the body, in the soul. And it's been this evolving thing that's been super fun to produce. And we also have some fun with some, certain episodes. We did a series on microdosing where we did a 3-part series looking at how does it work? Does it work? And looking at how does it have potential to ultimately become a FDA approved medicine? And the very first episode, I actually did a ketamine therapy experience myself. And I got an intramuscular injection of ketamine at Mindbloom and reported on what that experience was like. So a little bit of gonzo journalism sprinkled in. And yeah, it's been a really fantastic, fun project, and one that I'm really excited to keep doing. And yeah, so many interesting people to speak to and learn from.
Yeah, well, it's a very interesting time. We're in a renaissance. And so there's a lot of knowns and unknowns, and there's a lot of very, very smart, interesting people trying to figure things out. And so I know when I want to get on the cutting edge, your show is where I will be tuning in. And so
Cool.
I will link to it in the notes. And thanks for coming on today, man. It was really fun. It was fun to connect with you again and just to hear about what you guys are thinking about. And if anybody out there is starting a company in mental health improvement, think of PsyMed Ventures. You guys are, I know you're great partners to all your companies.
Awesome. Thank you, Scott. This was awesome. And yeah, I appreciate your way of hosting. You ask great questions.
Thank you. All right. Well, we'll see everybody on the next show. Thanks so much.